So many people are looking to live happier, more stress-free lives. We provide interviews from mental health experts across various fields because we know finding quality information isn't always easy. Let's find more sanity together. Many of you may remember hearing a lot about the opioid crisis before the time of COVID-19. Opioids were one of the leading causes of injury-related deaths in America. According to the National Center for Health Statistics, almost 450,000 people died from opioid overdoses between 1999 and 2018. So has the opioid crisis just resolved, or has it become the forgotten epidemic? The American Medical Association released an issue brief in May that noted their concerns that state and local media were reporting an increase in opioid-related deaths. Also, a study conducted by the Wellbeing Trust predicted during COVID-19, approximately 27,000 to 154,000 Americans may die from drug and alcohol abuse or suicide. It appears that the opioid crisis is still very much alive. On today's show, we will discuss the seemingly forgotten opioid epidemic, how people get addicted to drugs, and effective substance use treatment. This brings us to our guest, Dr. Craig Henderson. Dr. Henderson is a professor of psychology at Sam Houston State University and a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Texas. He has conducted research on adolescent and emerging adult behaviors and substance use treatment for 20 years. Just on this topic alone, he has been an author in approximately 100 peer-reviewed publications and book chapters, and has been involved in 16 grant-supported research projects, many funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Association. Now let's get to the interview. Welcome everybody to Sanity Podcast. Craig, thanks so much for being on the show.
Yeah, you're welcome, Jason. It's good to see you. Spent some good years together at Sam Houston State University, and I'm just really thrilled to hear all that you've got going on. And so, and I got to tell you, man, this is a first for me. I've never been a podcast guest. So
yep.
I hope I don't let you down.
Well, let's be honest, it's the first time for me too. So we'll see how this goes. I've just been seeing, a bit in the news about this opioid crisis and substance abuse and, hearing about people drinking more, smoking more, doing other drugs. And so when I was thinking about, what do people want to hear during, this COVID situation, substance abuse popped in my mind. And then when I thought of that, I said, who better than Craig Henderson? Because this is something that you've been doing researching for a very long time.
Well, thank you, Jason. Yeah, it's been on my mind a lot too. I'm reading and keeping up, and unfortunately, the news is not good. It seems like Daily Beast did a really nice article. It's called something like the twin pandemics, and recently read that. I think it came out sometime last week, but it's got me thinking even more. We of course, everyone's minds on COVID. It's in fact impacting all of our daily lives. And at the same time, for people who have things like, particularly the article was focused on opioid addictions. I mean, that never went anywhere. So how do these two pandemics really interface with each other? And we're seeing that they do. And I think this article does a nice job of laying out in which ways it does.
Yeah. And before jumping into the opioid epidemic, specifically in people with substance use disorders, I was just wondering, if we could talk a little bit more generally on your opinion on how the stresses with the COVID situation is impacting everyday people and their substance use, the reasons for it, and maybe some ways that you've been recommending to patients or supervisees on how people could cope better so they don't have to rely on substances to get through this.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think one of the big issues, and we're all facing it, is social isolation. There is a cost, and I mean, everyone is connecting through internet. I wish I'd bought stock options in Zoom a year or two ago, just because that is the new place where people meet. But it's just not the same. And I'm actually recording this in my workplace in a break room. I thought I'd be the only person up here, but I've seen a couple people, and someone just comes in and says, "Wow, it's nice to see a real person." And in ways it is, and I've had the opposite effect, like where I'm watching a television show, like something on Netflix or something like that, and people are hugging, they're shaking hands, and it's like, whoa, you aren't supposed to be doing that. So, and these kind of, these social norms have been disrupted in huge ways, and I think that isolation has a real cost. In terms, so that's one of the big ways. Let me think of some other ways it could be.
Yeah, and I was also thinking, like the economic struggles that people are getting into. People are worried about their money. Also, people with kids, parenting. They're now the teacher, and they're expected to work a full-time job, or they're not working and they have to supply, their kids. So the economic toll of this must also be increasing people's anxiety, and also just the uncertainty of our future. As we know, being psychologists, that uncertainty breeds anxiety. And for most of us, I would imagine this is one of the most uncertain times that many of us have ever been through.
That's right. Yeah, it was a real eye opener to me. I'm a proud Gen Xer, graduated from high school in 1987, born in 1969. And, so a couple of things have really hit me. I mean, one was that this COVID that we're living through is going to impact my kids much more than probably anything in their lifetimes, and the particular eye opener is this is much more real to them than 9/11 was, which was a real marker for me, probably for you as well. Another thing, so my son is a sophomore in college. Okay. So, he has now lived through, he was born when 9/11 happened. He lived through our previous economic crisis, the 2008 through 2010, the bursting of the housing bubble and that's impact. And now COVID. And, for these, like 18 to 25-ish year old people, these are, they're impacted, and we're in, maybe they weren't so aware just because they were younger when the housing bubble burst, but those things are going to impact their families, and we all are shaped in big ways by the interactions that we have with our family. And also notable about that particular age group, say 18 through 25 or so, the onset of substance use disorders is typically in those teenage to young adult years. If you get past those without developing a substance use disorder, chances are you aren't going to develop one in your lifetime. So, a number of people, one of the leading adolescent substance use researchers, Mike Dennis, has referred to these as adolescent or substance use disorders are just chronic disorders with an adolescent onset.
Yeah, and that's a great point, and I think that's a huge thing for people to know. Yeah. Yeah, and I was saying, like, I think it's a huge thing for people to know that if you don't become a substance abuser in your teens, that you're protected into adulthood, and so it's a really sensitive developmental area for this.
Well, it is. I mean, and it's protective. I mean, some people, and if we're talking about opioids in particular, you're talking about a large group of people who developed substance use disorders outside of those adolescent years. So, age is protective. At the same time, I mean, it's not an on-off switch. Okay, you made 25, you're never going to develop this.
Sure.
So,
yeah, and going back to your point about the and I forgot the phrasing that you exactly said, but that idea about the co-epidemics happening at the same time and how they're merging. From your understanding, how do you see COVID-19 impacting the opioid epidemic?
Okay, you mentioned the economic situation. This has hugely impacted millions of people's lives, and we see it, playing out every day about disputes and arguments about, should we, stay put until things are more safe? I mean, should we reopen? But the stimulus overall is a good thing. One thing we have to think about with the stimulus is, people are getting cash back. If someone has a drug problem, where is that money potentially going to go? And there are other ways in which it can impact it as well. Supply lines are, it's more difficult to get opioids into the country. So the supply lines are disrupted. So that overall is a good thing, I think. But there are, unintended consequences or unforeseen consequences in that as well. If you decrease supply, the cost is going to go up. And so if you have people who maybe, their livelihood has been disrupted, they still have a need for these drugs. Well, where are they going to go? It's probably going to be from some, illegal kind of means, to be able to get the money to purchase the drugs. Another thing that another unforeseen consequence of this is maybe the supply lines. I even saw that one of the main manufacturers of one of the chemicals that goes into fentanyl is located in Wuhan, China. Okay.
Oh.
And that, so it closed down about a year ago.
And just people might not be familiar with fentanyl. Do you mind just describing what it is and what it's used for?
Yeah, so it's what's called a synthetic opioid. So an opiate, ATE, is naturally occurring, opioid. What you would get like from a opium poppy, heroin, if you're going old school, opium itself. Opioids are synthetically made. So, those are, human-made chemicals that are designed to have the same chemical properties as these opiates. So fentanyl is a synthetic opioid designed to mimic the effects of heroin. The point I was making earlier is, in terms of unforeseen consequences, okay, supply lines are disrupted. Maybe people are making a less pure product now. There's less opiates going into what's in distribution now, okay? Well, what happens when those supply lines are opened up again? Well, people buying what they're used to using, maybe getting a more pure substance, that has a higher concentration of opioids in it. And, unfortunately, we may be seeing more overdoses as a result.
And I'm just thinking that not even that, they might be cut with something if there's low supplies, right, and people don't know what they're going to be using that it's cut with, whether it's a psychoactive substance or something else that could be toxic for the body.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And that is part of what the danger is with these synthetic compounds, is we don't know exactly what is in them. And, it's not just the overall levels. Sometimes with fentanyl overdoses and deaths, it's because just some bad substances were in there. So and what it is mixed with.
And this leads me to a question of what is the trajectory? And actually somebody asked me, they said, okay, so you just start taking opioids, are you just going to die? How does that work? What is the usual trajectory of how it goes from misuse into potential overdose, or is there a typical trajectory?
There is a typical trajectory. With opioid use, we're still learning a lot of what we call the developmental psychopathology of that. Basically, that's a fancy term that means the way a psychological or psychiatric disorder develops. I had mentioned earlier how substance use disorders have an adolescent onset. Just a interesting fact there too. What we're seeing is those who start using earlier actually tend to have more severe problems and more chronic problems overall. So age is a really important piece there. So in terms of, we're still learning, so we know how substance use disorders in general develop. We're still learning a lot about opioid use. A lot of that, the generation came from overprescription of opioids with in most cases a unawareness of the impact that these would have on people's lives. A belief that was held to in the medical community that people would not develop dependence if these were used for legitimate physiological reasons, and so that's what we that is one of the big initiators of the opioid use problem in this country. We're still learning how people get off of these drugs. It is most of the time through treatment. Going cold turkey is quitting altogether is a very, very difficult process. The body is physiologically dependent on these drugs. It is, pretty extreme biological reactions, can cause extreme amounts of anxiety. And so it's usually through some kind of intervention that people do recover.
And just to get a sense of the addiction and the withdrawal, where does this stand in severity compared to maybe some other drugs where it comes to how addictive it is and how bad the withdrawal is?
So the two main drugs where the body develops a genuine physical dependence on are going to be alcohol and opioids or opiates. So other types of drugs are not going to have the same kind of physiological impact where the body, becomes dependent on those. With alcohol, you can, literally die without, having it in your system. Opioids are, generally you will not die from not having them in your system, but it's a very miserable process to come off of them. And so that's why the treatments that are most effective are going to be what's called medication-assisted treatments, or MAT. three main groups of those. There's methadone, buprenorphine, and naltrexone are drugs that have been developed. These are synthetic chemicals, but what they are able to do is to produce a similar impact as opioids, but a lower, less potency. And so it can keep someone from having those extreme physiological and psychological reactions from coming off, but also deters some of the problematic behaviors in terms of, criminal activity and things that are associated with it. So
it's almost like how when people are trying to quit smoking, they have the nicotine gum packs with the decreasing amount of nicotine, and hopefully at the end it will slowly lower and you could get off. Right. That's a really good analogy. Okay. Yep. And on the psychological side, this is where your expertise truly lies. What are the latest treatments that get people help for this?
So for opioid use disorder?
Mm-hmm. Or substance use disorder in general, and opioid use disorders.
Okay, yeah, because it's a bit different. Let's start with opioid use disorders. Really, the only research-supported treatment for opioid use disorders is going to be medication-assisted treatment. So that has to be a part of that. Now, that medication-assisted treatment, that's not everything in itself. Okay, mm-hmm. So that helps keep a person, kind of physiologically in line, helps them manage their lives more effectively. But counseling is a big part of this as well. So one thing that I'm really excited about, and it looks like I'll have some opportunity to get involved with some colleagues in providing family-based treatments for young people, say ages between 16 and 25, getting medication-assisted treatment and involving families in that process. That's something that has not been really developed to any great extent. And there's a lot of potential for this type of work, because what we see in terms of just substance use disorders in general, the family involvement in treatment is hugely impactful and related to success. So there's a recent meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is basically combining the results from a large number of studies. And what was shown in this meta-analysis was that involving families in treatment had a meaningful impact above individual treatment. Okay. So here we're comparing not just family treatment against a control group of no treatment or some kind of placebo of just like giving someone attention or something like this. We're talking about an active individual treatment and still the family treatment. Adding the family component is adding improvement on top of what you would get with the individual treatment. So, this is really exciting. Hope we have the opportunity to do some of this work.
And is it too early in sense, or do we know why adding the family members is more effective than just the traditional, therapist patient type of therapy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Okay, so there are a number of reasons why. I mean, families generally are going to be our hugest sources of support. They can also be our, one of our biggest stressors. So when things are managed, family relationships are good, it generally keeps people, healthier, happier. If someone's prone to anxiety or depression, it helps, minimize those types of issues. So that, the support, the well-being that comes from having strong relationships, the help that we get, you mentioned early on, like with the COVID stuff about kids who are now, families who are thrown into being, homeschooling their kids on top of everything else.
Yep.
So, there's those kind of family supports. If we're talking about, again, going back to young people, adolescent age, that's a really formative time of development. And families that are able to maintain healthy lines of communication and be able to talk with, their adolescent sons and daughters, adolescent children about, the difficult things that they're going through in their lives, like, peers who are using drugs. It's really an important mechanism in that a protective mechanism, meaning, protective being less likelihood of developing problems. Also, if we're talking about young people, there's the issue of family togetherness and family awareness of what types of activities their kids are involved with and, the type of peers they have. So that also is another way where family relationships are impactful. So the family-based treatments are really, the research has shown, and I've been involved, I've written a number of review articles with colleagues that are showing that the family-based treatments really have the strongest evidence of support for treatment of substance use disorders in general.
So including adolescents and adults?
Yes, particularly with adolescents, but with adults, there's some really interesting work. Barbara McCready at University of New Mexico has done with adult couples, married couples, and alcohol use disorders. There is a treatment developed also by researchers at the University of New Mexico called CRAFT, which involves, helping an involved and supportive other in someone's treatment. It has really strong evidence of success. So yeah, it helps both.
And with adolescence, is there something about the developmental period, or do we know that makes it that so much more of a chronic condition if it starts, earlier and it has a worse trajectory, or do we just not know that yet?
I think we do know it. It's getting a little bit outside my specific area of expertise, but I could put you in touch with people who study the neurophysiology more. But that's what makes it a sensitive period as well, is the brain is still developing in those teenage years. Okay. So it's not until roughly around the age of 25 where the frontal lobes of the brain fully develop. And those are going to be very important in terms of, planning, organizing, directing our behavior, but also in terms of, the ability to inhibit impulses and things like this.
Okay, and then psychologically, or just more outside of biology, is there things like peer pressure with adolescents, or trying to fit in more adolescent sex, or anything like that makes them more predisposed to being pulled into it than adults?
I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, because that is going to be hugely important, and it's those years. One of the foremost adolescent researchers, actually internationally, is a person by the name of Lawrence Steinberg. He's at Temple University. But he has shown in a number of studies how adolescents are more susceptible to peer influence than at any age of the lifespan. Another thing is that young people are involved in a number of different systems. So like school, having problems in school puts adolescents at risk for substance use. It's not just their peers. It can just be, difficulties in the school environment itself. So that's another source by which what makes adolescents particularly vulnerable.
Yeah, and then just thinking about, going back to the COVID situation, just psychologists in general are worried about people becoming more depressed and anxious. And there's a lot of different reasons why people become more depressed and anxious during these times. I'm assuming that there's some sort of link between depression, anxiety, and substance use, or is it the other way around? How does that work?
There is. Actually, we have a book chapter coming out in a edited volume. One of my doctoral students led the development of the chapter, did a really nice job with it. But he lays out 3 or 4 main pathways by which young people develop substance use disorders. One is externalizing pathway. And, with this, you can think of someone who is genetically and temperamentally maybe predisposed to problems with impulse control and sensation seeking. So that is just more, has a larger impact as them as an individual than others. So that's one way in which people enter. Another is called an internalizing pathway. And internalizing, think about things like anxiety and depression are classic internalizing type of behaviors. And some people can get into it that way with using drugs to be able to diminish the impact of anxiety and depression. A third pathway is contextual pathway. This is where families, peers, neighborhoods people grow up in have an impact, and those can all shape. There's no one specific pathway in to substance use. All of these things kind of come together in complicated ways. And, the corollary to that, though, is there's no specific way out of them. So there are a number of ways by which people, can come out of substance use disorders as well. So one thing that's kind of encouraging about this research is, even though people may have to get treatment on a number of occasions, the treatment is effective. It seems to have there's something like a potentiating or carryover effect from each time someone seeks treatment that, eventually leads to recovery. Time is there's the phrase, the time is healer of all wounds. And that is certainly true when we're talking about substance disorders too. People tend to age out of those, even, those with pretty severe problems, 50s and 60s, people tend to age out of those. Now, that's a long time to wait. And I don't advocate waiting from teenage to 60 years old, because there are treatments that work. But a number of people do recover without getting into treatment.
And how effective are we finding, the current treatments?
They're actually quite effective. So they have, effect size as a way of measuring the impact a particular intervention has on changing a disorder. Treatments are now in the effect size of this is kind of technical, but like 0.4 to half a standard deviation. And in this area of research, that's a very meaningful result. So there are a number of treatments that really have been developed through many years of research support. I've been involved with some of the development and testing of family-based treatments, a particular treatment called multidimensional family therapy that has a strong record of success. There are others like that. Cognitive behavioral therapies tend to be strong. There is a motivational interviewing when it's combined with something called motivational enhancement therapy, has had really strong track records. So these are specific treatments that are specifically developed by researchers for treating adolescent substance use. And all of these, I and my colleagues have shown, all of these are well-supported interventions. But what we're also seeing, and this is kind of a newer line of research, is, one of the problems is these name brand types of therapies aren't being used in a lot of just, the treatment center in your community, maybe, because there's, they tend to be kind of expensive to get staff trained in. There tends to be some overturn in terms of the staff. So it's difficult to, treatment agencies face some difficulties in being able to maintain continuity. Now, some of them do it just great. I've, multidimensional family therapy, or MDFT again, there have been treatment agencies across the United States, some in Europe, who have been doing this for a number of years. But that's still kind of a drop in the bucket compared to the number of treatment agencies that are involved in the United States in general, if not internationally. What we're seeing is that there are ways that, specific practices that can be done in places where they might not have this type of specific training to improve what they're doing. One of the main ways, we were talking about it earlier, is involving families in treatment. So that's a practice that tends to lead to better results wherever you're doing it.
It's just to give people a sense of if they know somebody or they themselves might want to go for treatment because they're struggling with substances. You named three, very specific therapies. Could you just go over what to expect if they were, like, what does that treatment even look like? The family approach, the CBT approach, and the motivational interviewing approach.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Let's talk about each of those. So a family approach, what it will. Now, there are variations on this kind of thing, but, as the name implies, families are going to be involved in treatment. These types of approaches usually, if you, and each one of these, there is some standardization where providers can use a treatment manual that basically walks them through how to do this type of work through a treatment episode. So in family therapies, it's going to involve some time basically getting to know each other, building rapport. Therapist needs to form relationships with both adolescents and parents, which can be a challenge. There will be some time that's spent on helping them communicate more effectively and solve problems together. A lot of those, it kind of depends on what approach we're talking about. Some of these family therapies really advocate for having all family members together in all sessions. Some are more flexible, like they might, therapists might meet with the adolescent alone, might meet with the parents alone, then bring them together for a specific family session. Generally, these are also known as family systems treatments. So therapists in these type of treatments are generally working with external systems, so like schools, justice systems, and courts, if the kids are involved in those. So usually it's about 3 to 4 months, weekly sessions, I would say, and some of those involving just the adolescent, some involving the entire family. Some may involve the parents, and depending on some situations, the parents themselves might have some substance use problems, and so then an important part of the treatment is getting the parents into treatment somewhere, so they're getting help for their issues at the same time.
And what is the mechanism of change in that therapy? Is it the problem solving and the better communication, so they figure out ways to get around? Like, what sorts of things are they actually working on in these sessions?
So the better relationships, having the more functional communication around difficult subjects like substance use, and as you repair relationships, having parents more involved in their kids' lives. And, when you are able to build a more trusting and warm parent relationship, usually adolescents are more into having their parents know more about what they're doing. They can see that this is actually good for them, and there's less resentment involved in that when the relationship is healed to some extent. So those seem to be the better relationships in general, being able to have good communication around difficult subjects, and having parents more involved in what's happening with their kids' lives day to day.
And then how about CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy? How would that sort of treatment approach work?
Yeah, so CBT, I mean, that's something, the word is out in terms of the effectiveness of CBT. And in fact, I hear it, I actually listen to podcasts like this one quite a bit. And so people are getting more and more aware of it. What CBT has to do with helping people become more aware about their own thinking about their problems. There's a lot of things that we tend to, thinking errors, so to speak, that we tend to get, all of us have a tendency to get into, things like, blowing problems out of proportion, personalizing things that we may not need to, all or nothing types of thinking. I mean, these are things that are known as thinking errors. And so in therapy, helping people to become more aware of the types of thinking that they have around, particularly something like substance use, or, things like you could apply this also in terms of how a kid thinks about their peer relationships, things like this. I mean, you know a great deal about CBT actually, and could probably add quite a bit to that.
Yes, CBT and generally, CBT and substance abuse isn't one of my main specialties. But I think you hit it on the head. The way that we think about situations impacts how we feel, behave, and just generally react. And so it sounds like what you're saying related to substance abuse, that if we could overall decrease different types of negative thinkings and people are coping better and they're thinking about drugs in a different way rather than being their mechanism for handling things or seeing how it's impacting their life, they would then make adaptive change. They would make positive change in their life because they're feeling better emotionally and they have a different view system on what the drug use actually does.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And also changing some of their behaviors. So I did a treatment study. It was published in American Journal on Addictions, 2016, I think. This was we did this in a local juvenile probation department using a treatment called the adolescent community reinforcement approach. And the idea behind that is to get young people engaged in pro-social types of activities. And this was kind of individualized. I mean, these kids had different interests and things like that, but the therapist would work really hard with them to develop those interests and, find ways that they could spend time doing these things, find ways that their families could support them in that and maybe get involved. And so getting involved in these pro-social types of activities really kind of took their attention away from, the drug use and, the context in which it occurred, like the peers they were using with and stuff like that. So it's both of those things.
And it kind of goes with that adage with kids. You can't just tell them what not to do. You should help them figure out what to do instead. And sort of the same thing here. Like, it's not just don't use drugs, but what can you do instead to help yourself feel good, that's more healthy and adaptive and hopefully promotes, a better life outcome and more development.
Absolutely. I'll use a personal example
Sure.
there. I've got a 15-year-old daughter at home. Okay. It works a lot better when I'm saying, hey, let's do something together. Let's do these things. Then, let's go for a walk together. Let me hear you. She enjoys playing the guitar and piano. Let me hear you play your music. It works a lot better to engage her in these type of things than to just say, you're spending too much time in your room. You need to get out more.
Or you're spending too much time on your phone. Stop it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you have to give them an alternative to do. So, I mean, as cognitive behavioral therapy implies, it's both the ways that we think, but also the ways that the things that we're doing and behaving. Motivational enhancement therapy and motivational interviewing. These tend to be briefer types of treatments. They tend to occur together. Basically, therapists. So one of the main assumptions, I mean, you tell me, what's change that you made in your life? Any big change that you made?
Yeah, I mean, big changes that I've made have been moving. I shifted professions. As you probably know, I was a forensic psychologist, and I changed trajectories to become a therapist. But most recently, I had gained about 15 pounds during quarantine. So a big change that I made was food logging, healthier food choices, and I've happy to say that I've lost 10 of the 15 pounds. So a lot of changes over time.
Yeah, good for you, man. Well, I mean, weight loss is a really good example because, I've lost quite a bit of weight myself. And I thought, there was a long period of me thinking, I got to do something about this before I ever did anything. Okay. So we have this when we make a big change of behavior, ambivalence is inherent in it. We both want to change and we don't want to change. Motivational interviewing and motivational enhancement therapies are ways to work with people so that the desire to change outweighs the ambivalence of not to change. It involves with helping, in very intentional ways, helping people to talk about their problems in a way they talk about change talk. So working with a client to visualize for themselves ways in which they can change and talk in those ways. And clients can literally talk themselves into the changes that they enact. So,
And how might that be different than just telling somebody they need to change? And I'm thinking about reactance, but I mean, what are some other ways?
So people who do this kind of work, they talk about it as a scale. All right. And so the ambivalence is a scale, and you're kind of like, part of you wants to change and part of you doesn't want to change. Well, when you, as the therapist, come down really hard on the change part, there's the scale will naturally try to balance out so that they give themselves more and more reasons why they should not do what you're saying. So it kind of works on that principle. And reactance, kind of reacting in an opposite way because we don't like what we're being told from someone is a way that functions.
Mm-hmm. And does reactance at all come into play with having adolescent kids, or?
Oh, yes. Maybe even more so.
Yeah. And one thing about Craig's weight loss journey was his realization that he needed new clothes lagged behind. So there was a period where his clothes were quite larger than his frame.
Yeah, but I actually felt good about it, even though I looked foolish.
So thinking about substance abuse treatment, I was just wondering how it might have changed since the past, because in the past there was this debate, and it might still be ongoing in some areas, where is substance use an actual medical or psychological condition? Is it not? How it should be treated? And I'm sure there's some people who were in treatment earlier on that might remember being in a treatment that might not have been crafted the best way, and they had a bad experience. So what were some pitfalls in substance use treatment before, and how is it any different now?
Well, I think one of the big issues is we tended to think about, and I think even societally we're seeing changes in this, but we tended to think about substance use problems were due to some kind of moral weakness, whether that's, kind of like from a religious standpoint, like sin or something, or, a person is just weak-minded. There's something wrong about them. And thinking on that has really changed a great deal. I think the AANA movement was helpful in that regard, in not stigmatizing so much. But there are some. AANA works for lots of people, and there's some research on there about how it works, and it tends to be the support networks that are developed. But moving from that moral weakness model to, I mentioned those three paths: the internalizing, externalizing, and the contextual. Really, a fourth path that we talk about in that chapter. And I should, mention this student's name, give him a plug, Max Christensen. So is a repeated use model. And that is where the brain physiologically changes in response to the drug. So this is a different process than the kind of like the physiological addiction the body develops. But this is where the brain is actually changed in ways in which we get reinforcement and motivation are changed and become more geared toward, the drug use. So drugs, change our brains in fundamental ways. So that realization has been one. Also, a lot of the stigmatization really, and I guess it goes along with the moral weakness, but, some of the not as beneficial, impacts of things like the AA and NA is, this idea that people have to be, 100% abstain from any kind of drug use for the rest of their lives, is a lot of people will not sign up for that. And that's something that has changed. And I think that's a positive benefit as well.
So how has it changed exactly from this complete abstinence model?
Well, just the idea that, that substance use disorders are time limited, that, you can achieve, great progress in life without total, and still, use drugs recreationally. That kind of, more of a harm reduction type of model where we're looking at reducing the societal harms that come about through drug use. So these are, more modern ways of thinking that I think are helpful.
Okay. And, in this section, we've been really focusing on, so the disorders here, how do we sort of undo it? How do we help people recover? Do you have any sort of thoughts on sort of like a primary response more so? How do we help people currently at these times of stress not even get on the road to addiction?
Yeah. So you mentioned it earlier, coping. I mean, there's, coping is a big way. I would say, even though it's not ideal, find ways to connect with people, even if it is virtual. Spend time each day doing something that, brings you joy in life, whatever that may be for you. Invest in relationships. It's, as people are together more, conflict is just occurs because it tends to occur more frequently. But, finding ways to resolve that conflict. And I don't know, looking for ways that I'm finding, this has been tough for me in many ways, and ways that I'm finding that help me are just accepting the fact that life is majorly altered, and that I just can't do some of the things that I used to really enjoy doing. And accepting that, but also with the mindset of there's going to be an end to this. I saw something really encouraging, last night about a company that has done the first safety trials on a vaccine,
Yes.
and the results are positive. Legit treatment trials with therapies that are working. So there's going to be a way out. One of the people who I'm really following almost religiously through this is, are you familiar with Andy Slavitt?
No, I'm not.
Okay, so he's the former, under the Obama administration, he was head of the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare. And so he knows a lot about health policy, but he puts out a Twitter thread each day that, goes 20, tweets deep on, what he has learned for the day. And he's got this catchphrase about, we're going to get through this together. And it's simple, but I think it's helpful. And seeing, as we see the politicization of this, along with everything else, and the demonization of the other side, just taking a step back and thinking, okay, we're all in this together. We're suffering in different ways. And, how can we help each other get through this? So, so the acceptance, for me, religion and connecting to a higher power is something that's really meaningful. And for me, I found I have a purpose in life. I'm not just being withheld, from things I don't want to do, but actually me staying home is very often the loving thing, because, I am making a choice not to possibly transmit the virus onto someone else, and not to be a carrier of that. So, seeing in small ways that there's a purpose to, this prolonged social distancing. So, and then, I think it's super encouraging news that, that we're getting about outdoor activities, and that these done, with reasonable modifications can, and getting outside and doing stuff, especially this time of year. I mean, it's nice, to get outside now. So that can be, that being active, exercising can be really helpful in that regard as well. So.
Yeah. And the acceptance piece, I think that's big for me too. And a lot of times when people think about acceptance, they think about it as an easy thing to do. It's this very easy thing to do. But acceptance is hard, because it's very easy to accept things that are positive. It's not so easy to accept things that are negative. So acceptance isn't an easy practice. It's actually a hard practice. Another thing that I've been working on is more of that mindfulness way of living, of taking it day by day and being here and now, and trying to spend less time, worrying about the future. Not that I shouldn't worry at all. I shouldn't think about it. Of course I should, but just trying to take my time to just be in the here and now and live my life as it is and enjoy it.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, of course, the behavioral activation is what we call doing more activity in CBT. But yeah, of course, the more, very simply, the more pleasurable and positive activities you do, the better you feel. And so as long as it's safe to do, of course, in the situation, whether that's inside or outside, that could help maintain or elevate mood.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. One thing that you had talked about when we were talking before this was styles of therapy that are not the traditional in the room, one-on-one or family. And you had given me some good reasons as to why these other types of interventions and what they are. And so I was just hoping that you could speak on that as well.
One of my, closest friends and colleagues works for an agency in New York called the Center on Addiction. And they have some really, some non-traditional ways of reaching people. And if you don't mind, I have some stuff I'd like to take a look at here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, some of the services that they have available are one-on-one support helpline. So a helpline that connects parents and caregivers to a trained specialist. So this is a 24/7, contact that can be made there. The specialists are there to help the provide support and help the families, find answers from themselves. They have text networks. So people who are either going through trouble themselves, or let's say parent of someone who is having trouble, can be involved in these text work. So text network. There are online support communities. So where people can work with trained parent coaches and other people who are going through similar challenges in their lives, and they can get individual coaching as well. And so I think that these are just some really good resources that are out there that people can connect with. And I'll provide you with some of this information, so that your listeners can access these directly. The organization which they come from is called drugfree.org. So the URL is HTTPS. So there's an S at the end there, HTTPS //drugfree.org. And so there's a link where you can find their services available. The text network, you can join by texting word join to the number 55753.
Okay, great. And of course, I'll include these links in the organization and in the podcast notes.
Yeah. Oh, and I wanted to tell you, speaking of podcasts, I listened to a really good one yesterday. Very first episode was yesterday, called In Recovery. And it's available through, I got it on Apple, but the woman who's doing it has been, she's a physician, been an addiction specialist for 20 years, had a really interesting podcast yesterday about medication-assisted treatment for pregnant women, which is going to be a huge issue because if someone who is pregnant on opiates, they're going to have to take medications to be able to come off of that. So some of the challenges that are there, she was talking about how some of these women have basically support advocates who can, advocate for them in getting different services that they need. So it's called In Recovery. And I was really impressed. I'm going to listen to it every week. So it's kind of like yours. It's given it a lay person's level. So.
Okay. Yeah. And I could definitely link her podcast too. Any way to help people get, this information is a wonderful thing.
Yeah. Not to drive any listeners away from you. So.
So with those sort of resources that you were talking about, is that predominantly for substance use, or can people use that for other problems as well?
Those are predominantly for substance use.
Regarding these types of, the peer-to-peer support, the texting type platforms, is there any research on the effectiveness or how it has been helpful?
Yeah, there are a few articles on the peer-to-peer networks. I mean, this is a very new area. It's just that people haven't studied it. So there are a few out there. There's more. You'll find things on teletherapy now, which, kind of like the broad generalization there is that teletherapy is as effective as face-to-face. So there's a good emerging body of research there. Few studies out there on text-based applications, but yeah, that's the research needs to catch up to what people are doing. So, and I'm not one of those that thinks that we need to study these things in depth before we actually make use of them. But I look forward in the next few years to seeing more research coming out.
And you had noted when we had talked before, something specifically around dropout rates being lower, people coming to treatment more often. And I think it was with the text-based platform. Am I remembering that correctly?
Well, it's a way to improve access. So, one of the things that has not changed is that only about 10% of people in need of treatment actually get it. And so It's these mediums like this that really help improve access. So it kind of it's bringing the service to them. I mean, like we're seeing now happening all the time with teletherapy. I mean, there were lots of people who needed this before COVID came along, but this is really, really turbocharged that whole thing. So.
Okay. Well, Craig, thanks so much for coming on the show. I think that this information was beyond valuable to people and people that are in need of understanding what's going on with substance use, particularly during the COVID time. How people actually become involved in substance use, and also different ways that they could be treated for it, and different, of course, resources in order to get that help.
Okay, well, great. I enjoyed doing it, Jason, and it's nice to connect with you virtually.
Yep, and we'll keep in touch.
All right.